to 1927. The number of Negro desertion / abandonment or non-support cases that came before the Court of Domestic Relations increased almost 100%. In 1927, there were 813 cases, or 19.5% of the 4,168 cases handled by the court. Wow. So, okay. So back in that time, there was a thing where if your husband ran off and abandoned you, you could go to the court. They would put out a warrant for his arrest. He would serve time. Or the court would come after you and make you financially provide for your wife and children. So spousal support and child support is not something new. It has always existed. A check of the records of the United States Charity showed that this agency had handled 750 Negro cases of family abandonment during the 2.5 years from January 1 to 1926. January 1st, 1926 to June 30th, 1928. When one examines the records of social agencies concerning these abandoned families, they read very much like the records which were quoted from Birmingham, as witness the record of the United States Charity on a deserted or an abandoned woman living in the second zone. So they're just telling the story of this woman who was abandoned by her husband. And she came to the office to get assistance because, he left her to fend for herself. So Miss G in office asking assistance because Mr. G had deserted her in June. She met her husband in St. Louis and knew him 10 months before marriage. They came to Chicago directly after marriage. Her husband was a good provider, but abused her. Remember they said, we're not like our grandmothers. Our grandmothers were submissive and in happy marriages, but no one knows that, but the records don't lie. A lot of these women were in abusive marriages with men who were cheating on them, but they stayed because they were financially dependent on the men. But if the men got up and left, what could they do? So anyway, it says he was a good provider, but abused her, beating her and quarreling continually. He is big-headed. This caused the separation. He does not drink, but is very hard to get on with. As he is continually fighting, she thinks he has gone off with a woman who lived next door. Family desertion on the part of Negro men, not the women. Family desertion on the part of Negro men and its relation to the organization of the Negro community in Chicago represented the same picture in the 1940s as in the 1930s. So, and I have this book too, The Black Metropolis. So no matter what state, the picture was the same. Black women were being abandoned to raise children alone. And so they would have to go to offices to get assistance or to get help because they could not do it on their own. The behavior of Negro deserters or men who abandon their families, who are likely to return to their families even after several years of absence, often taxes the patience of social workers whose plans for their families are constantly interrupted. So another thing that was happening, the men would run off, abandon their wife and their children, leave her with nothing to provide for herself. So the woman would go get assistance. Then as she's thriving and getting back on her feet, he pops up like, baby, I'm home. And he comes in and disrupts everything, demanding her attention, wanting her to do certain things. And it's like, it would throw off the plans of the social workers for the families. And it was very annoying. And I would get annoyed too if I'm trying to help a woman who was abandoned to fend for herself. And I'm trying to help her get on her feet and stuff. Then all of a sudden this man comes back into her life who abandoned her, but she wants the father of her children to be there. So she takes him back and he just disrupts everything. I would be very annoyed too. The last part, family desertion among Negroes in cities appears then to be one of the inevitable consequences of the impact of urban life on the simple family organization and folk culture which the Negro has evolved in the rural South. That was that was a lot to read. Okay. So this was one of the books that was referenced, Black Metropolis. This book was written, I think they said this book was written in 1945, maybe. Okay. So Black women were getting government assistance way before 1960 because they were constantly being abandoned to raise children alone at such high rates. So what does the book The Black Metropolis say? The most disorganized individuals and the indigent age tended to live in this area, dependent upon the ministrations of public charity. So this was 1945, I believe. So way before the 60s, like we're being told. What else this book says? Okay. This notorious and widespread wandering has been primarily a search for better or supplementary jobs. Thousands of sharecroppers have traditionally left their wives and children at home while they went to the cities for the lumber and turpentine camps during laying by time to gain a supplementary income. Many of them never came back to the subordination of the cotton fields. Thousands flocked north during the Great Migration and through the fat years and the lean. They are still coming. Some sent for their wives and sweethearts. Many didn't. Many of the men just left their wife out to dry, left her to fend for herself. They never went back. Beginning with economic necessity, this pattern has become a custom which runs on its own steam. A wanderer's life, let me rephrase that, a homosexual's life is an exciting life. Okay. So let's see. I'll just start here. Unstable common law marriages of relatively short duration alternate with periods of bitter disillusionment on the woman's part. The end result is often a widow and her children, caused either by a husband's abandonment or by a wife's impetuous dismissal of him. After about three out of every 5 lower class men and women in Bronzeville claim to be married. Census takers do not ask to see marriage certificates, so the figure includes numerous common law marriages. So often we hear that Black women and men were more married back in the day. Some of them were just living together like husband and wife, but they weren't married. So that increased the number on the certificates. Some of the married women were married on paper, but their husbands ran off and left them. So those two weren't really taken into consideration when they did the census, because if they put things like, oh, they're just living together, they're not married, and if they put things like she's married but her husband ran off on her, the numbers would look a lot different. So over half of the unmarried women claim to have been married at some point of their lives. The bulk of these have listed themselves as widow, a term which Bronzeville's lower class women use to include desertion or abandonment. Only 1 woman in 5 listed herself as single, and this term too probably includes some wives who have been abandoned. Wow. That's interesting. So the marriages back then were not all they claimed they were. On paper, it looked one way, but in reality, it was a completely different thing. Okay, so just for the record, lower class households, any household that makes less than 48,000 a year. I don't know what lower class was back then, but basically poor Black people. Most Black people were not middle class back then, but Anyway, so the desertion rate is very high among the Negro lower class throughout the United States. So what's messing up the Black community also is men who have no money impregnating women and abandoning that woman. So that woman has to fend for herself, and that makes it harder on her. Like the study says, single mothers tend to struggle more, especially if you have multiple kids, like the Black women did back in those days, and some do now. So it makes it a lot harder because you have to pay a babysitter, you have to pay for daycare, you have all these extra costs. Whereas if you were single, you could actually rise out of poverty. But so lower class was just if you made us under middle class, like if you made a certain amount below the middle and the rich people. So between 1928 and 1933, this is still from the book The Black Metropolis. Yeah. Between 1928 and 1933, about 25,000 Negro babies were born in Chicago, and of those, more than 2,000 were illegitimate. That means the woman wasn't married. The greater number of these babies without fathers were born of young lower class women. I believe that's what it says. I kind of cut it all because I just wanted to focus on this part. Especially the subtitle, Babies Without Fathers. Okay. So while much of the instability of the family is due to desertion on the part of the males, see, we have that word again, and this is a whole different book. This is the Black Metropolis. So let's reread that again. The instability of the family. So when they say the destruction of the Black family, we'll say, let me rephrase that. While much of the destruction of the Black family is due to abandonment on the part of the males, a not inconsiderable proportion is due to the eviction of males by women who have decided not to put up with foolishness any longer. So there were men running off, abandoning their families. But then there were women who women went through hell dealing with men, and they finally got to a point where they were done putting up with their bullcrap, and they put them out. So, but even that is like your behavior is what helped to destroy the family because you couldn't get it together, and women should not have to put up with any kind of behavior just to say they have a man. So one high school girl cited an instance where a husband finally wandered off after several years of strife. Internecine strife. My mother and father have been separated for years. I don't miss my father at all. He was so unpleasant that I was glad to see him leave. He gambled and drank and didn't provide for the family. This is what most women are dealing with when they keep a man around just to say they have a man, or because they want a man in a house to be a father to their kids, but they aren't getting it. They're just getting adult children who sit around and don't contribute at all in any way, and the children suffer also. We had to go on relief, so assistance, because of the way he acted. So I hope I never see him again. This is a girl talking about her father. He abused mother too. My mother has had a very hard life. She married young, and he started mistreating her right after I was born. I'm the oldest, and he made her life so miserable that she had to leave him any number of times. But she always went back on account of us. So she's describing her experience as a child who was in the home, and her father was in the home. Her mother wanting to have a man in the house for her children, wanting to not be a single mother. She kept taking this horrible man back, and the children were suffering. So it says sometimes a desertion is accompanied by a vindictive stealing of. So this story talked about a guy who went and stole all the money that this woman had saved up for, and she kind of went into a depression or something like that. So I kind of cut that part off too. But yeah, it was talking about how the man becomes vindictive and tries to do things to hurt the woman. So anyway, another source. This is a book that was published in 1919, a few years after Franklin Frazier graduated. This book is called Broken Homes. Now, this book was written, I believe, so this book was written to help social workers know how to deal with men who were abandoning their families. Okay. So I'm just going to read the highlighted part. Only in rare instances will the deserter or the man who abandoned his wife and children accept the entire responsibility for his act. To try to find justification for doing what we want to do is characteristic of human beings, and the deserter is no exception. He attempts to rationalize his. So let me stop there for a second. Aren't we hearing all over social media and everywhere men justifying why they abandoned their children? All a woman has to do is cough the wrong way and poof, they're out of the house. And it's probably because they don't want to be there anyway. They want to be out living life, doing them. They don't really want the responsibility of children. They want to knock women up to derail her life and to secure a permanent place to stay if he should decide to come back. And a woman lets him sometimes because she wants a dad for her child, but at the expense of the child. So they're all over embarrassing themselves, justifying why they are committing acts of degeneracy, because abandoning your child is degenerate. So they're all over everywhere justifying why they walked out on their children. So the men choosing to not take responsibility for abandoning their children is as old. Okay. Is as old. Let's just ignore that S right there. Is as old as 1919. The men justifying abandoning their children is as old as 1919. The men going to other people to seek out validation for choosing to abandon their children is as old as 1919. He attempts to rationalize his conduct and so regain his sense of self-approval and well-being by finding excuses and justifications in the conduct of others. So we're seeing that. I remember I saw this video on Facebook one time. This man got on live and he's like, I'm done with this. I'm signing over my rights. I can't do this anymore. He was complaining about the mother. He was saying something like she won't cooperate or something she wasn't doing. But he got online so that people could say, see, I understand these women. They make it so hard for you. I support you. He got online for that reason, to get approval for his degenerate behavior, because he knows there are so many other men out there like him and so many women who condone their behavior. He knew he was going to get this validation and approval that he wanted. So even when the fault is all his, because no one can make you walk out on your family, no one can make you not be in your child's life. Even when the fault is all his, he usually succeeds in making himself believe that his wife is more to blame than he for his having left home. Aren't we seeing this all over the place? Like, this has been going on since 1919. Like, we're dealing with a group of men who historically have abandoned their families, who have historically made excuses, who have historically blamed everyone else for their behavior but themselves. This is historic, and I think it's something that should be looked into, like studied. So something that I often hear is people say, oh, the man left the home so that because the woman couldn't get assistance if he was in the home. But The only women who needed assistance were women who had been abandoned to fend for themselves. But they say, oh, he left the home because he wanted her to be taken. He knew in his absence she'd be taken care of by the government. So, but this book actually debunks this. This book was written in 1919, and this is a common excuse that people make for the degenerate behavior of men who choose to abandon their children. Expectation of charitable belief. It used to be held that many men who would otherwise remain at home and support might be encouraged to desert if they had reason to believe that their wives and families would be cared for in their absence. This was no doubt often the case before social workers had learned to discriminate in treatment between deserted wives and widows, or to press with vigor the search for deserting men. At present, it is the experience of social workers that few men deliberately reckon upon transferring the burden of their family support to others, or are induced by these considerations to leave. So this social worker is basically saying, nah, that's not true. That's not the experience of social workers. These men ran out on their wives and children because they wanted to, not because they wanted the wife to get help in their absence. So that was never true. So the truth about the man in the house rule and why it was instituted in the first place. So first things first, women could not own property until the 1990s. Black men were running out on their families as early as 1863. So if women couldn't own properties until the 1990s, how could a woman put a man out of a home that he owned if he owned that home? That was impossible. So I'm just going to read this. In 1839, New York, once again, being a leader in change, passed the Married Women's Property Act. This allowed women, more specifically white women, to be able to conduct acts of business on their own, giving them sole ownership of whatever property that was in their name. By the 1900s, every state gave married women control over their property, but they still had to have their husband's input. So married Black women could not put their husbands out of the home without his input, because men still had more rights than women, even back then. And single women were omitted from this act. There was absolutely no way that a Black woman could put a Black man out of a home that he owned and was paying all the bills in. Even married women had limited rights in the early 1900s when it came to property. So that's another fallacy. Women could not put men out the home that they owned if they owned those homes. So this quote, I like this quote. It says, past behavior is the most reliable predictor of future behavior. So if you can look in the past and see that a group of men constantly ran off and left their wives and children to fend for themselves, then you could probably expect the future men from that demographic to do the exact same thing. And that has been happening. So this is just something from Psychology Today about the past behavior is a predictor of future behavior. And it just says, but this is a gross oversimplification. Psychological scientists who study human behavior agree that past behavior is a useful marker for future behavior, but only under certain specific conditions. So the first one is high frequency. Habitual behaviors are more predictive than infrequent behaviors. So a habitual behavior is men constantly abandoning their wives and children. Can it be recorded in history? Yes, it can. It is recorded and it is documented that one group of men specifically have consistently abandoned their wives and children. Not all of them, but the larger percentage of them, I believe. Number 2, predictions work best over short intervals. 3, the anticipated situation must be essentially the same as the past situation that activated the behavior. Is exactly the same. It's like, our foremothers historically were being abandoned to fend for themselves in some of the worst conditions. Number 4, the behavior must not have been extinguished by corrective or negative feedback. So there was nothing that anyone could do to make these men not run out on their families. Even if back in the day, they were threatened with jail time. They were still running off, leaving their wives and children. Even with child support, the enforcement of child support, the consequences of not taking care of your children is jail time. They're still abandoning their children. So nothing has been able to extinguish this behavior. 5, the person must remain essentially unchanged. Historically, nothing has changed with the men. They have historically been this way. 6, the person must be fairly consistent in his and her behavior. Not only are they consistent, but they are all over justifying abandoning their children. So, yes, in this sense, past behavior is a predictor of future behavior. Looking at the past, you can predict what's going to happen. So, Black men have been deserting their wives and children since 1863. That's 97 years and 100 days before social workers sat down to discuss the epidemic of men running from their responsibilities. And 100 years and 100 days before the man in the house rule was passed in 1964. So, for 101 years and 100 days, Black men had been abandoning their women to raise children alone before the man in the house rule was passed. So this gives context to why the man in the house rule was passed in the first place. Hey. So in the late 1960s, Miss Katie B. Shaw, the director of aid to dependent children in Greene County, Alabama, reported that her clients want our help. Okay, her clients, this is her saying this. They want our help in getting rid of the men who live off their welfare checks. They really do. Many times I tell them, you shouldn't go with Mr. Jones or Mr. Washington because he's no good. And they appreciated it.